Synopsis of the books of the Bible. 1 Samuel. By J.N. Darby. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. 2 Timothy 3 verses 16 and 17. Synopsis of the books of the Bible. By John Nelson Darby. 1 Samuel, chapter 14. Jonathan's faith in God. But faith in God is always blessed, and if God has shown the effect of unbelief, he also shows its folly, since wherever faith is found, there all his strength is displayed, and then it is the enemy who is defenseless. Jonathan makes up his mind to attack the Philistines in the energy which he derives from faith in God, and if unbelief is manifest in Saul, the beauty of faith is exhibited in his son. The difficulties are not lessened. The Philistines are in garrison, and their camp situated in a place of unusually difficult access, a narrow pathway up perpendicular rocks being the only means of approach. The Philistines were there in great number, and well armed. But it is hard for faith to endure the oppression of God's people by the enemy, and the dishonor thus is done to God himself. Jonathan endures it not. Where does he seek for strength? His thoughts are simple. The Philistines are uncircumcised, they have not the help of the God of Israel. There is no restraint to Jehovah to save by many or by few, and this is the thought of Jonathan's faith, that fair flower which God caused to blossom in the wilderness of Israel at this sorrowful moment. He does not think about himself. Jehovah, says he, has delivered them up to Israel. He trusts in God, and in his unfailing faithfulness towards his people. His heart rests in this, see note, and he does not imagine for an instant that God is not with his people, whatever their condition may be. This characterizes faith. It not only acknowledges that God is great, but it recognizes the indissoluble bond, indissoluble because it is of God, between God and his people. The consequence is, that faith forgets circumstances or rather nullifies them. God is with his people. He is not with their enemies. All the rest is but an opportunity of proving the real dependence of faith. Thus, there is no boasting in Jonathan. His expectation is from God. He goes out and meets the Philistines. He is there a witness for God. If they are bold enough to come down, he will wait for them and not create difficulties for himself, but he will not turn away from those which meet him in his path. The indolent and at the same time foolish and imprudent confidence of the enemy is but a sign to Jonathan that Jehovah has delivered them up. Had they come down, they would have lost their advantage. In bidding him come up, they set aside the insurmountable difficulty of access to the camp. Happy in having a faithful companion in his work of faith, Jonathan seeks no other assistance. He does not talk of the Hebrews, but he says, Jehovah has delivered them up into the hand of Israel. He climbs the rock with his armor-bearer. And in truth Jehovah was with him. The Philistines fall before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer slays after him. But while honoring the arm which faith had strengthened, God manifests himself. The dread of God took hold of the Philistines and everything trembles before the man whom faith, God's precious gift, had led into action. Note. See the same proofs of faith in David when he went out against Goliath, end of note. Saul's unbelief and ignorance. Faith acts of itself. Saul is obliged to number the people to find out who is absent. Alas! We are entering into the sad history of unbelief. Saul endeavors to obtain some directions from the ark, whilst elsewhere God was triumphing over the enemy without Israel. The tumult of their defeat continues to increase, and unbelief, which never knows what to do, tells then the priest to withdraw his hand. The king and the priest were not the links between God and the people. There was neither the people's faith in God without a king nor the king whom God himself had given. Here again, instead of Israel, whom Jonathan alone recognized, we find those whom even the Spirit of God calls Hebrews, see note, who, although they were of the fountain of Jacob, is among the Philistines, content to be at ease among the enemies of God. Note. This is the more remarkable because the Spirit calls those who were with Saul and Jonathan Israelites. This gives special force to the word Hebrews, wherever it is found. God does not refuse the name of Israelite to the most timorous of the people. Chapter 13 verse 6, but he refuses it to those who join the Philistines. The idea was lost of the connection between the people and God. It was a nation like any other. End of note. Now that the victory is gained, all are glad to share the triumph and pursue the Philistines. The work of faith spoiled and hindered by unbelief. And poor Saul, what does he do? Never can unbelief, however good its intentions in joining the work of faith, do anything except spoiling it. Saul speaks of avenging himself on his enemies. Jehovah is not in his thoughts. He thinks of himself and hinders the pursuit by his carnal and selfish zeal. May God preserve us from the guidance and help of unbelief in the work of faith. God himself can succor us through every means, but when man mixes himself up with the work, he does but spoils it, even when seeking to bring in strength. Saul, at the moment of such blessing, is zealous to maintain the idea of honoring Jehovah's ordinances, as he sought to do previously in asking his counsel at the ark, making much of his name, as though the victory had been due to him, and it was only some hidden sin which prevented his obtaining an answer from God. He had nearly put Jonathan to death, through whom God had wrought. He would discover the sin by bringing in God, who acts indeed, but only to make manifest the folly of the poor king. Observe that faith in full energy can thankfully avail itself of the refreshment which God sets before it in its toilsome course, whilst the carnal zeal of that which is but an imitation of faith, and which never acts with God, makes a duty of refusing it. All that Saul can do, when he takes the lead, is to prevent their reaping the entire fruit of the victory. His intervention could only spoil the work of others. He has no faith to perform one himself. Nevertheless, God has pity on Israel, and keeps their enemies in check by means of Saul, for although unbelieving, he had not yet turned his hatred against God's elect. He was not yet forsaken of Jehovah. The contrast between Saul and Jonathan. But this painful and solemn moment is at hand. Meanwhile, he strengthens himself. There was constant war with the Philistines, but Saul, warlike as he was, could not overcome them, as David or even Samuel did. He sought carnal means amongst his fellows to attain his object. Observe here with what frightful rapidity, and how even at once, the enemy gains the upper hand when we are not walking in the ways of God. Compare 1 Samuel 7 verses 12 to 14, and 1 Samuel 13 verses 16 to 23. Observe also that all the forms of piety and of the Jewish religion are with Saul, Jehovah's priest in Shiloh, 1 Samuel 14 verse 3, wearing an ephod, and the ark, verse 18. He consults with the priest. He prevents their eating flesh with blood. He builds an altar. The priest consults God, and, God giving no answer, Saul is ready to slay Jonathan as guilty, because he had eaten in spite of the oath. Observe, at the same time, that it is the first altar Saul had built, that the priest is of the family which God had condemned. He builds his altar when rejected, and after the outward blessing which God had given, and which he attributes to himself, although he had only spoilt it. On the other hand, Jonathan's faith acts without taking counsel of flesh and blood. As the people said, 1 Samuel 14 verse 45, he wrought with God. The people did not know that he was absent. Happy Jonathan! Faith had led him so far in advance that he did not even hear the senseless curse which his father invoked on whoever tasted food. The folly of another's unbelief did not reach him. He was at liberty, as he went along, to avail himself of the kindness of his God with joy and thanksgiving, and he pursued his course refreshed and encouraged, happy walk of simplicity which acts with God. The consideration of these two chapters is very instructive, as setting before us the contrast between the walk of faith and that of the flesh, in the position which the latter takes, by virtue of its profession, in the work of God. It was the first time that Saul had faced the enemy on whose account God raised him up.